A man who swore never to trust again. A woman the whole town said was cursed. One brutal Wyoming winter that would either kill them both or forge something neither of them expected. Riker Boone had survived grizzlies, avalanches, and years of bitter loneliness on that mountain. But nothing had ever hit him harder than the moment a stranger in a dark coat stepped off a snow-dusted wagon and looked at him like she'd already survived 10 versions of him before breakfast. This is their story, and it doesn't start gently. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now sit back. We're heading into Black Hollow. The wind came down from the Absaroka Range the way it always did in late October. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like something enormous had exhaled up in the peaks and sent its cold breath scraping down through the pine valleys and into the bones of every living thing below. Riker Boone felt it through the gaps in the barn wall while he worked. I was splitting a frozen elk carcass by lantern light, methodical and unhurried, the way a man works when he's been alone long enough that the task itself becomes the only company. His breath fogged in white puffs. The lantern swung on its hook above him, throwing crooked shadows across the hanging meat and the rough-hewn timber walls. Outside, the horses shifted in their stalls. One of them stomped, a low, uneasy sound. Riker set down his knife and listened. Nothing but wind, and the distant moan of the tree line bending. I was 34 years old and looked closer to 40. Not because life had broken him exactly, but because life had worked him. The way weather works stone, wearing down everything smooth until only the hard angles remain. His hands were thick and scarred, his jaw dark with a week's worth of beard that he hadn't bothered to address. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that belongs to winter skies, and to men who've learned not to expect much from either the weather or other people. He'd been alone on Black Hollow Mountain for going on 6 years now. 6 years since he'd buried his father, Cale Boone, in the rocky ground behind the cabin and walked back to the house to find the place both emptier and heavier than it had ever been when Cale was living. 6 years since he'd stopped going down to the town of Cutter's Ridge more than once a month for supplies, and even then never staying longer than necessary. People in Cutter's Ridge had opinions. They had questions. They had the particular talent of small-town folks for looking at a solitary man and deciding he must be either dangerous or pitiable, and Riker was too tired for either conversation. He went back to the elk. I was nearly finished when he heard the horse. Single rider, moving fast down the main trail from town, which was unusual at this hour. The trail grew treacherous after dark, the switchbacks slick with ice, and nobody who knew the mountain rode it at speed after sunset unless something was wrong. Riker wiped his blade on a rag, walked to the barn door, and pushed it open. A reader appeared at the edge of the property, a man in a long dark coat on a well-fed bay horse that clearly hadn't been born anywhere near a Wyoming mountain. Town horse. The rider pulled up short when he saw Riker standing in the barn doorway, lamplight behind him. "Boone, man!" the man called out. "Riker Boone." Riker said nothing. He waited. The rider nudged his horse forward a few steps, close enough that Riker could make out the face. Young, maybe 25. Clerk's hands, soft around the jaw. He was holding a leather satchel against his chest like it might leap away if he loosened his grip. "I'm from the 1st Territorial Bank," the young man said. He had that particular voice, tight with borrowed authority, a little too loud, compensating for the fact that he was alone on a dark mountain delivering news that nobody was going to want to hear. "I have correspondence for you, from Mr. Silas Granger." The name landed in Riker's chest like a stone dropped in cold water. Silas Granger. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over a year, and he hadn't missed it. "Leave it on the fence post," Riker said. Mr. Granger said, "I said leave it on the fence post." A pause. The horse blew steam. The young man set the satchel on the top rail of the fence with visible relief, turned his horse around, and rode back down the trail without another word. Smart enough to understand when a conversation was finished. Riker stood in the cold for another minute before walking over and picking it up. He read the letter at the kitchen table while a pot of coffee went cold beside him. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the table and stared at the wall for a long time. The language was formal, as banker's language always was, courteous in the way that a blade is courteous when it goes in clean. But stripped of its legal clothing, the meaning was simple enough. His father, Cale Boone, had borrowed heavily from Silas Granger's bank 12 years ago. The loan had been secured against the Black Hollow property, the cabin, the land, the trap lines, all of it. Cale had apparently made payments for several years, then stopped, then made irregular partial payments, then stopped again. The interest had compounded. The debt had quietly metastasized in the bank's ledgers while Cale was dying, and Riker was too deep in grief and isolation to think about anything as mundane as finances. The total owed was significant, more significant than anything Riker had or could earn in 2 years of trapping. The bank was prepared to exercise its legal right to foreclose on the property within 60 days. Unless Riker presented himself at the First Territorial Bank at his earliest convenience to discuss an alternative arrangement that Mr. Granger believed would be mutually satisfactory. Riker read that last line 3 more times. Mutually satisfactory. He'd been in enough negotiations with enough men like Silas Granger to know that those words never meant what they seemed to mean. They meant, I have something you want, and I'm going to extract something from you in exchange, and I'm going to make you feel like you should be grateful for the opportunity. He drank the cold coffee. He didn't sleep much that night. Cutter's Ridge sat at the base of the mountain like something the mountain had shrugged off. A collection of timber-framed buildings along a main street that turned to mud in spring and froze solid in winter, with a population of roughly 300 souls who all knew each other's names and most of each other's business. Riker rode in 3 days after receiving the letter, on a gray morning with snow threatening from the north. He tied his horse outside the First Territorial Bank, the most solid building on the main street, brick where everything else was wood, with the bank's name stenciled in gold paint across a wide front window. The kind of building that announced its own permanence. That said, everyone around me will change, and I will remain. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and paper and something faintly chemical. Ink, maybe, or the particular scent of money being kept very carefully in a secure place. A young woman behind a desk looked up when Riker came in, then quickly looked back down at her ledger. I was directed to wait, and then to a back office, where Silas Granger stood up from behind a mahogany desk and extended his hand with the smile of a man who'd had decades of practice making other men feel like guests in rooms they actually owned. Granger was in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that was calibrated rather than accidental. His coat was expensive but not ostentatious, his hair combed with precision, his boots polished. He had a broad, pale face and small blue eyes that were consistently warmer than whatever was actually going on behind them. Riker, he said, I appreciate you coming down. Sit, please. Riker sat. He didn't remove his coat. I imagine you were surprised by the letter. I was surprised my father borrowed money from you and didn't tell me. Granger made a small, sympathetic noise. Cale was a proud man. He intended to settle it before you ever had to know about it. Unfortunately, he spread his hands in a gesture of mild regret. Circumstances. How much? Granger told him. Riker didn't flinch, but he felt the number settle over him like a weight. It was roughly what he'd expected from his own mental arithmetic. Not ruinous to a man with different resources, absolutely ruinous to him. You mentioned an alternative arrangement, Riker said. I did. Granger leaned back in his chair and crossed one leg over the other. He had the body language of a man who was comfortable taking his time. There's a woman, Eleanor Vale. She arrived in Cutter's Ridge about 2 weeks ago, and she's in a rather difficult situation, through no fault of her own, I should add. He paused, watching Riker's face. She needs a husband. Specifically, a husband with property and standing, someone established enough to satisfy certain legal requirements. I have business reasons for wanting her settled and stable here rather than moving on. Riker stared at him. You're telling me to marry a woman I've never met. I'm telling you, Granger said pleasantly, that if you marry Eleanor Vale within the next 2 weeks, I will forgive the entirety of your father's debt. The Black Hollow property remains yours, free and clear, in perpetuity. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. I'm not asking you to fall in love, Riker. I'm offering you a transaction, a practical arrangement between practical people. She needs a legal husband. You need your land. What's wrong with her? The question came out flat, without inflection, but Granger understood exactly what it meant. Nothing's wrong with her, he said. She's a grown woman, 30 years old, intelligent, from a decent family back east. She's had some difficulty in her recent past. Nothing that concerns you directly. The town has talked, as towns do. People have said things that are, another pause, carefully measured, not entirely accurate. What has the town said? Granger smiled the way a man smiles when he's choosing how much truth to dispense. That she's bad luck. That she was involved in some trouble back east. The two men she was associated with came to ruin. He waved his hand dismissively. You know how people talk. Riker did know how people talked. He'd been on the receiving end of it. And you want me to marry her, he said. I want you to give her a home, Granger said. Whether it becomes anything beyond that is between the two of you. But legally, formally, on paper, yes. A marriage. Registered and recorded. Riker stood up. I'll think about it. You have 4 days, Granger said pleasantly. After that, I'm afraid the bank's timeline becomes inflexible. Riker didn't stay in town. He bought his supplies, loaded his pack horse, and rode back up the mountain without speaking to anyone else. He didn't want to hear what people were saying about Eleanor Vale. He could guess the shape of it. Rumors in small towns had a predictable architecture, built from some fragment of truth, and a great deal of imagination, and a community's deep need to make sense of anything that didn't fit its existing categories. A woman alone, from somewhere else, arriving with no explanation. That was all it took. He spent 2 days on the mountain thinking about it, not about Eleanor Vale. He couldn't think about her concretely because he didn't know her. He thought about the land. He stood at the edge of the property at dusk and looked at the cabin his father had built from timber. He'd cut himself. The outbuildings they'd added together, the trap lines that wound through the valley like a map of 30 years of work. The graves behind the cabin, his father's, and further back his mother's, a simple wooden cross that had weathered to silver. This was not just property, it was the only continuous thing in his life. He rode back down to Cutter's Ridge on the 4th day. She was staying at the Cutter's Ridge boarding house, in a room at the back that got no morning light. Riker stood outside the boarding house for longer than he needed to. He'd agreed to the meeting. Granger had arranged it, very formally, over coffee in the boarding house parlor, which meant there would be a chaperone of some kind, and the whole thing would have the stiff theatrical quality of a business negotiation conducted in the wrong language. He went in. The parlor was small and overheated. A fire burned too high in the grate. Mrs. Crane, who ran the boarding house, and who Riker had known his entire life as the town's most dedicated keeper of other people's information, sat in a wingback chair near the window, with her hands folded and the expression of someone who expected to have an excellent story to tell by dinner time. Granger stood near the fireplace with a cup of coffee, perfectly composed. And Eleanor Vale sat on the settee. Riker's first impression was of stillness. Not passivity, not the stillness of someone waiting to be told what to do. A different kind. The stillness of a person who had learned a long time ago how to take up exactly as much space as they needed and no more, and who was not particularly bothered by the silence of rooms. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was well made but not new, her dark hair pinned back without any of the elaborate architecture that women in town favored. Her hands were in her lap. She was watching him the way people watch something they haven't yet decided what to make of. Steady, without hostility, without warmth exactly, but with a quality of attention that made him feel like he was being read. She was not what he'd expected. He hadn't known what he'd expected. Something more. Demonstrably fragile, maybe. Or demonstrably anxious. Something that would confirm the transaction's inherent absurdity. Eleanor Vale looked like someone who had already thought through several scenarios worse than this one and was prepared to handle them. Mr. Boone, Granger said, allow me to introduce Miss Eleanor Vale. Eleanor, this is Riker Boone, whose property at Black Hollow I mentioned. Miss Vale, Riker said. Mr. Boone. Her voice was even. Not cold, but controlled. The voice of someone who had learned that certain tones invite certain responses and had chosen her register accordingly. Granger began speaking about the arrangement in his measured banker's way. The terms, the timeline, the legal requirements. Riker listened with half his attention and spent the other half watching Eleanor, who was listening to Granger with the expression of someone who has already heard this speech and is waiting for it to end so the actual conversation can begin. When Granger finished, she said, Mr. Boone, I'd like to speak with you directly, if that's acceptable. Mrs. Crane's eyebrows rose fractionally. It's acceptable, Riker said. Granger smiled. Of course. He moved toward the window, not quite leaving the room, which everyone understood was the compromise. Eleanor looked at Riker without preamble. I know what this looks like, she said. I know what you've been told about me. I know what the town is saying. A brief pause. I'm not going to try to convince you that none of it is true because some of it is. I've been in trouble. That trouble is not over. She held his gaze. What I want you to know is that I am not a helpless person. I'm not going to be a burden on a mountain. I've worked hard my entire life, and I'm willing to work hard here. That's all I'm offering. Hard work and honesty. Riker considered this. What trouble? I can't tell you everything yet. Not here. Her eyes moved briefly toward Mrs. Crane's direction without her head moving. But I will tell you. Before winter is over, you'll know everything. That's not very reassuring. No, she agreed. It's not. But it's honest. He sat with that for a moment. Can you ride? He asked. Something shifted in her expression. Almost amusement, quickly contained. I can ride. The trail up to Black Hollow is rough, especially in snow. There's no road past the 2nd-mile marker, just a track. In winter, it takes 4 hours on a good day. I understand. It gets lonely up there, for people who aren't used to it. She looked at him with those steady eyes. Mr. Boone, I've been alone in rooms full of people for years. I expect a mountain will be simpler. He didn't have an answer for that. They were married 3 days later, in the small office of Cutter's Ridge's Justice of the Peace, with Silas Granger and Mrs. Crane as witnesses. The ceremony took 12 minutes. There were no flowers. Eleanor wore the same dark blue dress. Riker wore the cleanest shirt he owned, which was cleaner than people might have expected, but not much. The Justice of the Peace, a tired man named Colton, read the words with the enthusiasm of someone reading a bill of lading. Eleanor said, I do, in the same even tone she used for everything. Riker said the words when it was his turn. Granger produced the documents, signed and countersigned. The debt was formally dissolved, registered in the bank's records. The original loan note marked paid in full. When it was over, Riker held the door open for Eleanor as they stepped out into the cold November air. She was carrying a small bag. She'd left the rest of her belongings to be picked up. Your trunk, he said. I'll get the wagon. It's already on the wagon, she said. She'd arranged it that morning while he was settling things with his supplier. Without being asked. Without making a production of it. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. All right then, he said. They rode out of Cutter's Ridge in the early afternoon, with the sky the color of old pewter and snow beginning to spit from the north. The first hour of the trail was manageable, a wide enough track through second-growth timber, evidence of old settlement along the edges, the remnants of fence lines, and one abandoned structure collapsed under years of snow load. Riker rode ahead. Eleanor followed on the mare he'd brought down for her, and she handled the horse well enough that he stopped worrying about that particular problem. Neither of them talked much. There wasn't much to say, and the wind was picking up, which made conversation an effort in any case. By the second hour, the trail had narrowed and steepened. The snow was coming harder now. Not a blizzard yet, but purposeful, the kind of fall that means business. The trees here were older and denser, lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce, their branches already heavy. The light was going gray-green and flat. Riker pulled up at a fork in the trail and waited for Eleanor to come alongside him. From here it's steeper, he said. Another 2 hours. Maybe more in this snow. He looked at her. You can turn back if you want. I can take the trunk. She looked up the trail without much expression. Then she looked at him. Is that an offer or a test? He hadn't expected that. Neither. Then I'll ride on, she said, and nudged her horse forward. He watched her for a moment before following. They climbed in silence. The snow deepened around them. At one point, Eleanor's horse hit a patch of ice and scrambled sideways into the brush. She rode it out without panic, without making a sound, settling the animal with her weight and a quiet pressure on the reins. A woman who knew what she was doing on a horse. He filed that away. At the 3-hour mark, when the trail had narrowed to single file and the wind was cutting hard through the gap between two ridges, he heard her say something, not to him, but to herself or to the horse, quietly. Come on, then. The horse pushed forward through a knee-deep drift, and she moved with it, not fighting it. When they finally came through the last stand of spruce and the cabin appeared ahead in the clearing, dark timber, low roof, smoke coming from the chimney where he'd left a banked fire, Riker felt the habitual relief he always felt at the end of a mountain ride in weather, the solid satisfaction of arrival. He glanced back at Eleanor. She was looking at the cabin. Her face was difficult to read, but there was something in it. Not dismay, not the forced performance of acceptance. something quieter and more genuine, like a person recognizing something they'd been looking for and not quite believing they'd found it. She said nothing. He dismounted and led both horses toward the barn. The cabin was one main room with a sleeping loft above and a smaller back room that had served as his father's office. Shelves of journals and ledgers, surveying equipment, a narrow cot. It was not large. It was not comfortable in the way the boarding house was comfortable. The ceiling was low. The windows were small because small windows held heat. The furniture was functional and nothing else. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room and looked around with a systematic attention that reminded him, oddly, of the way he surveyed new trap territory, noting what was there, assessing what was missing, calculating what would need to be done. "The back room," Riker said. "It was my father's. You can use it." She nodded. "There's a water barrel that needs to be filled from the stream most mornings. The stream's about 80 yards northeast. I'll show you tomorrow." "All right." "The firewood stack is on the east side of the barn. I usually go through about 3 cords before spring." He paused. "There are rules on this mountain, things you need to know to not get killed." She turned and looked at him with that steady attention. "Tell me," he told her. He went through it methodically. The ice on the north trail, the places the wolves denned, the sound a storm made when it was coming, the signs of predator activity in fresh snow. What to do if she encountered a bear that hadn't gone into full hibernation yet. He watched her face while he talked. She was listening the way few people listened, not just waiting for him to finish, but actually taking it in, storing it. When he was done, she said, "What about your traps? The lines?" He blinked. "What about them?" "If I'm going to be here and you're going to be gone for days at a time, I should know where the nearest lines are, in case something goes wrong, and I need to find you." He hadn't thought of that. Or rather, it had been so long since anyone else was here to think about it, the thought had never formed. "I'll draw you a map," he said. "Thank you." They ate separately that first night. He heated beans and salt pork at the fire. She disappeared into the back room after taking a small amount of food with her. He didn't know what she was doing in there and didn't ask. The cabin was very quiet with another person in it, which was strange because it had always been very quiet without one. He lay in his bunk in the loft that night listening to the wind work at the roof and thought about what he'd gotten himself into. He didn't have an answer. He supposed he'd find out. November blew itself out in a series of storms that came and went like arguments, brief, savage, and followed by a terrible cold stillness. Riker was gone for 3 days in the first week, running the far trap line that stretched into the upper valley. When he came back, the fire was burning well, the water barrel was full, and the torn leather of his spare coat, which had been sitting in a heap in the corner for 2 months waiting for him to get around to it, had been repaired. Clean stitches, properly tensioned, the patch cut from a piece of hide he kept in the supply box. He stood there looking at it for a moment. Eleanor was at the table reading one of his father's journals. She didn't look up immediately. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "The thread I used is in the tin on the shelf. In case you need to know the color." He hung his coat. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She looked up then. "How are the traps?" "Good. Beaver, mostly. Some mink." He paused. "Did you eat?" "Yes. There's something wrong with the north chimney flue. I noticed it smoking when I came up through the gap. I'll fix it tomorrow." She nodded and went back to the journal. He stood in the middle of the room, slightly wrong-footed, which was an unusual sensation for a man who'd spent 6 years being comprehensively comfortable in his own home. "What are you reading?" he asked, mostly because he needed to say something. She held up the journal so he could see the cover. His father's handwriting on the spine. Field Notes, Vol. 7, 1871, 1873. "He wrote about the mountain beautifully," she said. "He noticed things." Riker felt the particular small grief of someone being told something good about a dead person. "He did," he said. "He wrote a passage here about watching an elk cross a frozen lake at sunrise. 3 paragraphs. She glanced down at the page. "It reads like poetry." Riker moved to the fire and crouched down to add wood. He hadn't read his father's journals since Cale died. Hadn't been able to. They were right there on the shelf, and they might as well have been locked. "You can read them all if you want," he said. "There are about 20 of them." "Are you sure?" He poked at the fire. He'd have liked someone reading them. He always said they weren't just for him. A silence, then quietly, Thank you. He didn't look at her. What? Snow hit in earnest in the second week of December. Not a blizzard, not yet, but a sustained heavy fall that lasted 3 days and piled up against every vertical surface and transformed the mountain into a place that looked entirely unlike its autumn self. The cabin disappeared up to its window ledges. The path to the barn became a tunnel that had to be cleared twice daily. The horses were restless and needed more tending. Riker taught Eleanor how to split firewood on the fourth morning after the snow. Not because he'd planned to. It was simply that he came out of the barn to find her already at the splitting block, the axe in both hands, trying to work out the physics of it with the focused expression of someone determined to manage by logic what they lack in experience. Her first swing hit the log at an angle, and the axe glanced off. Her second swing was better, but lacked the follow-through. He watched from 10 feet away for a moment, then said, "You're stopping the swing too early." She looked at him, not offended, just asking. He walked over and picked up the short-handled axe from the pile. "You're thinking about hitting the wood," he said. "Don't. Think about driving through it. The wood is just in the way." He set a log on the block and split it in one motion, not showing off, just demonstrating the mechanics. Feel the weight of the head. Let it do most of the work. You're guiding it, not powering it. She looked at the 2 pieces of split wood. Then she picked up the full axe, set a new log, and tried again. The swing was better. The log split, not cleanly, but adequately. "There," he said. She set another log. Split it again, cleaner this time. He didn't tell her it was good. She didn't need him to tell her. He could see she already knew by the way she set the next log. He went back to the barn, but he looked back once, from the doorway. She was working steadily through the pile, her breath coming in white puffs, her movements getting more confident with each swing. Her hands would be blistered by the end of it. The axe handle was rough, and she wasn't wearing the right gloves. She'd figure that out on her own. He thought, she's going to be all right on this mountain. He wasn't entirely sure he'd expected that. The conversations began accidentally, as conversations in small spaces usually do. It was a practical matter at first. He'd say something about the weather or the condition of the trail. She'd respond. He'd follow up. Small observations exchanged over meals or by the fire in the evening. Nothing that felt like a relationship. Just 2 people managing the logistical reality of sharing a space. But one evening in mid-December, 3 weeks into it, he came back from a short run on the East Line to find Eleanor sitting at the table with one of his father's journals open and tears on her face. She wasn't making any noise about it. If he hadn't been looking, he wouldn't have known. He set down his pack and started removing his outer gear without saying anything. But then he found himself saying, "Which one?" She looked up. Not embarrassed exactly. More like someone who'd been caught in a private moment and was deciding how to handle it. "Volume 11, she said. "He writes about your mother." Riker went very still. "The winter she was sick," Eleanor said. "He describes sitting up with her night after night." She paused. "He writes about being terrified and trying not to show it, about talking to her about everything and nothing to keep her awake." Another pause. "I'm sorry. I should have asked before reading this one." "No." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "It's all right." He sat down across from her at the table. He hadn't done that before, so he sat across from her deliberately, with nothing to do. He looked at the journal in her hands. "He never talked about that time," Riker said. "Not to me, not directly." He was quiet for a moment. "I was 12. I knew she was dying before he did, or before he admitted it." Eleanor didn't say anything. She was listening with that same quality of attention she gave to everything, and something about it, the realness of it, the absence of performance, made it easier to keep talking. "He wrote it down instead," Riker said. "I guess?" He cleared his throat. "Did you lose someone? Is that why—" "My father," she said. 5 years ago. It was quick. We didn't get to talk." She looked down at the journal. Reading this, she shook her head slightly. He said everything to her. Everything he was afraid of. Everything he loved. He just said it. Most people can't do that. "No." Her voice was quiet. "They can't." They sat there for a while. The fire moved. Outside, the snow was falling again, visible through the small window as a gray softness against the darkness. Riker couldn't have said exactly when he stopped thinking of her as a stranger. It happened somewhere in that silence. By January, the mountain was truly itself. The cold reached a depth that was different from ordinary cold. It had weight to it, substance, a physical presence that made the air feel thick and reluctant. Temperatures dropped to places where metal burned bare skin and breath froze in midair before it dispersed. The wolves were out every night, their voices carrying from the North Ridge in a way that had stopped being eerie and simply become the mountain's nighttime language. Food was the real mathematics. Riker was a good hunter and a careful planner, but a winter this severe taxed the larder in ways that required constant management. He was out on the mountain more often, pushing into harder terrain to find game. Some days he came back with nothing, some days with enough to put them ahead for a week. There was a rhythm to it that he understood in his bones. The mountain gave what it gave on its own schedule, and a man's job was to be ready when the giving happened. Eleanor learned this rhythm alongside him. She never asked him why he came back empty-handed. She never made sounds of concern or distress about the state of the food supply that would have required him to perform reassurance. She simply managed what was there with a precision that he found himself watching with something close to admiration. She knew how to make broth from bones that he'd considered spent. She knew how to stretch dried beans into things that were almost substantial. She found a cache of his father's preserved stores, dried apples and smoked venison, behind a panel in the back room that Riker had completely forgotten about, and she produced it one evening like a quiet act of magic. "Behind the lower shelf," she said, setting the smoked meat on the table. "There's a note in your father's handwriting. It says, 'For the long winters.'" Riker looked at the food, then up at her. "He was thinking about whoever came after him," she said. He had to look away. There was a night in the second week of January when the wolves came closer than they ever had. Riker woke to the horse's panic, the sound of hooves against stall boards, the high distressed whinny that meant something wrong and close. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, pulling on his coat and boots in the dark, reaching for the rifle above the door. I was outside and running toward the barn when he realized Eleanor was 2 steps behind him. She'd heard it too, gotten up just as fast, and had the pistol, his spare, which he'd shown her in the second week, and apparently she'd noted its location, in her right hand. He stopped for half a second and looked at her. She looked back, steady, waiting. "Stay at the door," he said. "If they've gotten in." "I know," she said. The wolves hadn't gotten in. The barn door was intact. But there were 3 of them in the yard. Big animals, gray winter thin, driven down from the upper mountain by something, hunger or cold, or both. They stood in the lantern light that fell from the barn window, watching Riker with the particular calm of predators that had gone past the point of being easily deterred. He fired once into the air. 2 of the wolves broke. The third stood its ground for a long, assessing moment, looking at Riker with yellow eyes that contained no fear, only calculation. Then it turned and loped after the others, unhurried. Riker let out a slow breath. "They'll be back," Eleanor said from the doorway. Not alarmed, factual. "They will," he said. "I'll lay traps along the north fence tomorrow." He turned to look at her. She was standing in the barn doorway in her coat and boots, her hair loose, the pistol still in her hand. She looked completely awake, completely present, entirely unshaken. "You've handled a gun before," he said. "My father taught me," she said. "He said—" a brief pause. "He said a woman alone should know how to be safe." He thought about that. "Where'd you grow up?" "Outside of Cleveland. But we moved. My father worked on the railroads for a long time." She was quiet for a moment, before he understood what kind of men he was working for. Riker stored that fragment. He'd learned that Eleanor released information in pieces, not as deception, but as a person who'd learned to be careful with the truth. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." The turning point, the moment that divided before from after, came at the end of January. It started simply. He'd been tracking a large elk through the upper valley for 2 days, following the trail northeast into terrain. Didn't usually hunt in deep winter, the ravines icy and treacherous, the snow unpredictable at depth. He found the elk on the second afternoon, made the shot cleanly, began the work of field dressing the animal in the failing light. He didn't notice the sound until it was almost too late. The grizzly was supposed to be in hibernation. Most were. But this one, a male, old and lean and deeply hungry, had been roused by something and was moving through the upper valley with a desperation that made it unpredictable in a way that hibernating season grizzlies usually weren't. It came out of a ravine downwind of the elk carcass, and it came fast. Riker had 1 second, maybe less, to raise his rifle, and in that half second he misjudged the angle. The shot hit but not cleanly, and the bear was on him before he could work the action again. What happened in the next 30 seconds was a series of physical facts that he would later be unable to fully reconstruct in sequence. The impact, the ground, the cold, the weight. A tearing sensation along his left side and shoulder that was so comprehensive it briefly registered as abstract rather than pain. He got the knife out of his belt. He didn't remember doing it. And the bear, already hurt and now confused by the smell of its own blood, pulled back. Riker lay in the snow. He could hear the bear moving away through the brush. He could see the sky. It was still light, but going dim fast. He thought with the particular clarity of a man whose mind is performing triage. I need to get back to the cabin. The cabin was 4 miles south. He stood up. Eleanor always said, later, that she knew before she heard him. She'd been at the window watching the light go, and something in the quality of the late afternoon had felt wrong. Not wrong in any identifiable way, just a heaviness in the air that made her feed the fire and check the medical kit and keep looking toward the tree line. She saw him come out of the pines. I was moving, but the way he was moving made her start running before she understood why. She reached him 40 yards from the cabin, in the gray light and the deep snow. And when she got her hands on him and understood the extent of what the bear had done, she felt something very cold drop through her chest that was not panic. Panic would come later, but was rather a ferocious clarity, a total narrowing to the single most important fact. He is alive, and I am going to keep him that way. I can walk, he said. I know you can, she said. Lean on me anyway. She got him to the cabin. What followed was 3 days that she never talked about in detail later, not because she wanted to forget them, but because they existed in a different category from everything else. The wound along his left side was deep, the shoulder torn, and fever came in the second night. A high, consuming fever that turned him delirious and made him speak in fragments. His father's name, words she didn't understand, once, just once, her name. She stitched what she could stitch. She used the herbs she'd found cataloged in one of Cale's journals. He'd noted which plants had medicinal uses, dried and stored some in marked tins. She boiled water constantly, kept the wounds clean, forced broth into him when he was conscious enough to swallow. She did not sleep. She sat beside him through the dark hours and through the gray frozen days, and she talked to him, not because she thought he could hear all of it, but because she'd read in his father's journals about sitting up with Riker's dying mother, and she understood now, viscerally, what that had meant. You talked because the sound of a voice was something to follow back. A rope in the dark. She told him about Cleveland, about her father, who had worn the same hat for 15 years and who could identify any bird by its call. About her sister, who she hadn't seen in 2 years. About the winter she was 10 and they'd been snowed in for a week, and her father had read to them every night until his voice gave out. She told him she wasn't planning to let him die on a mountain in January, so he'd better stop giving her reason to worry about it. On the third morning, his fever broke. His eyes opened, clear, not glazed, genuinely present. He looked at the ceiling of the cabin and then, slowly, at her. She was sitting in the chair beside his bunk, the medical kit open on the floor, one of his father's journals in her lap that she'd been reading aloud from an hour ago when she thought he was still unconscious. Eleanor, he said. His voice was rough with disuse. How long? 3 days, she said. He absorbed this. He looked at her face, really looked at it, the way he hadn't allowed himself to before, taking in the exhaustion in it, the shadows under her eyes, the absolute absence of anything performative in her expression. She hadn't slept. He could see that plainly. She hadn't slept in 3 days. He tried to say something and found that his throat was too tight for it. Don't, she said quietly. Just rest. He lay there looking at the ceiling and felt something happen in his chest that he wasn't going to examine too carefully. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if he could help it. But it was there. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that had nothing to do with gratitude, though there was gratitude in it. Something that frightened him in the way that things you've stopped expecting frighten you when they appear. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines. The fire burned low. The cabin was warm. He closed his eyes and slept. He healed slowly, the way men who refuse to stay still always heal. In fits and starts, 2 steps forward and 1 back, the wound reopening twice in the first week because he pushed himself out of the bunk before his body had agreed to it. Eleanor didn't argue with him about it. She just changed the dressing again without comment, her hands steady, her expression carrying the particular neutrality of someone who has decided that saying "I told you so" costs more energy than it's worth. "You're going to tear it again," she said on the fourth morning, when she found him standing at the window. "I need to check the horses." "I checked the horses an hour ago. They're fine." She handed him a cup of broth and didn't move out of his way. "Sit down." He sat down. Not because she told him to. He told himself that. Because his left side felt like it was on fire and standing was costing him more than it looked. The cabin felt different to him now. He wasn't sure if it had changed or if his relationship to it had. He noticed things he hadn't before, say, the way she'd reorganized the supply shelf so that the most used items were at the front, a small practical adjustment he'd never bothered to make himself. The mended places in the curtain over the east window. A tin of dried herbs on the table, labeled in her handwriting, that hadn't been there before the bear. She'd been running the cabin for 3 days while he was unconscious, and the evidence of it was everywhere. And it was the evidence of someone who paid attention. "The elk," he said. She looked at him. "I left it in the upper valley. 2 days' work." "I know. I found it on the second day." She said it the same way she said most things, directly, without build-up. "I got the rear quarters back on the sled before the wolves found it. Lost the rest." He stared at her. "You went up to the upper valley alone." "You needed meat in the cabin." "That's 2 miles of rough trail." "I'm aware of that," she said. "I went slow and I stayed out of the North Ravine like you told me." I didn't know what to say to that either. He was discovering that this was a recurring condition around Eleanor, a kind of conversational disarmament, where he'd prepared for a response that never came because she'd already done the thing that made the response unnecessary. "You could have been hurt," he said finally, and even as he said it, he heard how it sounded. Not like a rebuke, but like something more personal than he'd intended. She heard it too. Something shifted in her expression, a small adjustment, like a door opening a crack. "I was careful," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I came back." The fire popped. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. He looked at his hands around the cup. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it." A pause. "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You talked in the fever. Did you know that?" He looked up. "Not about anything I could follow," she said. "Fragments, mostly. Your father's name." She hesitated. "Mine. Once." He held her gaze and didn't look away from it, which cost him something. "I don't remember," he said. "I know," she said. "I just thought you should know." She went back to the shelf, and he sat there with the broth going warm in his hands, feeling something complicated move through his chest that he was not ready to name and might never be. February brought a different kind of cold. Not the sharp, aggressive cold of January, but something settled and permanent. As if the mountain had simply decided that this was its natural state and everything else had been seasonal. The snow was deep and crusted, and the light, when it came, had a thin crystalline quality that made the landscape look like something preserved under glass. I was on his feet fully by the second week, moving at 3/4 his normal pace and hating every reduced step of it. Eleanor watched him reclaim his routines without commentary. She'd learned early that offering to help when he didn't ask invited a kind of polite refusal that was more about pride than practicality, so she simply let him manage it and stayed available without making it obvious. She had her own routines now. He'd noticed them accumulating over the weeks, small daily patterns that had nothing to do with him. The hour each morning when she read at the table before he was up, the way she always walked the perimeter of the property in the late afternoon regardless of weather, notebook in hand, cataloging things. He'd looked at the notebook once, when she left it open. She was noting the birds, the tracks in the snow, the direction of the prevailing wind. Observational, systematic. "You're mapping the mountain," he said one evening. She looked up from the notebook. "Is that all right?" "It's fine." He paused. "Why?" She thought about it for a moment. "I spent a lot of years in places where I didn't know the territory," she said, "where I was always arriving somewhere and never staying." She looked back at the notebook. "I want to know this place. Properly." Understood that. He understood it in the particular way of a person who has also needed a place to be permanent when everything else wasn't. "Ask me," he said. "Whatever you want to know about it. I've been here my whole life." She looked at him across the table. Something in her expression was careful and also open, a combination that seemed characteristic of her, like a door on a good hinge, able to move in either direction without sticking. "All right," she said. And so they began, in the long evenings of February, an exchange that neither of them had quite intended and that neither of them wanted to stop. She asked about the mountain, its geography, its seasons, its history, and he told her, and then she told him things in return, because conversation, when it's real, moves in both directions without being forced. She told him about Cleveland and about the work she'd done there after her father died, bookkeeping for 3 different businesses, learning the architecture of financial records, how money moved and where it went, and how it could be made to disappear if someone knew what they were doing. She said this last part without emphasis, not avoiding it, but not highlighting it either, and he noted it and stored it with the other fragments he'd been collecting. He told her about the years after his mother died, the specific quality of a house where one parent is managing grief and a son is managing a father. Managing grief? And nobody is quite managing either thing well. He'd told nobody else this. It came out of him one evening without premeditation, while they were eating and she was asking about the journals, and he found he didn't want to stop once he'd started. "He used to go out to the trap lines and not come back for a week," Riker said. "I was 14, I ran the cabin myself. I didn't mind it. I was old enough and I understood why." He paused. "What I minded was that when he came back, he never asked how I'd done. He just came back and we went on as if nothing had happened." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "But you didn't go anywhere, after everything?" "No. When he died and you could have sold and left, you stayed. It's my land," he said. But they both heard that the real answer was more complicated, and he didn't try to elaborate on it. She nodded slowly. "It's yours," she agreed, "and that means something." The fire moved between them. Outside, the snow fell with the specific patience of winter that has no deadline. "Tell me something about where you grew up," he said, "that you actually miss." She thought about it. Not quickly. She was a person who thought before she spoke, which he'd come to value in a way he hadn't anticipated. "There was a library," she said finally, "near the 3rd house we lived in. It was open on Saturday mornings, and they had chairs by the window, and in winter the light came in a certain way that made everything feel stopped, like time had paused." She half smiled, and it was a real smile, not the careful, controlled one she used when she was uncertain. "I used to go and sit in those chairs for 2 hours every Saturday and read whatever I could find. I was very happy there." He looked at her. "We could get books," he said, "when I go down in March for supplies." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." A pause. Then the half smile again, quieter. "Something with some history in it," she said, "and something with a good story." "I'll do my best," he said, and he found to his own mild bewilderment that he meant it. The laugh happened on a Tuesday. He remembered that specifically afterward, not because Tuesdays meant anything on the mountain, but because the specificity of it seemed important. Not some abstract warm moment, but an actual Tuesday in February, with cold coming under the door and the horses restless in the barn, and Eleanor standing in the middle of the main room with his father's surveying tripod completely disassembled and spread across the floor like a particularly complicated puzzle. She'd been trying to use it to measure the angle of the roof overhang, for reasons that made sense when she explained them later but were not immediately apparent, and it had come apart in her hands in a way that apparently neither of them had expected. She stood there looking at the pieces. Then she looked up at him. "I think I broke it," she said. "It was already broken," he said. "It's been broken for 12 years. I just leave it assembled so I don't have to look at the pieces." A pause. Then she laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh or a performative laugh. It was a surprised one, the kind that comes out before a person can decide whether to let it out, the kind that has genuine amusement behind it. It transformed her face in a way that caught him completely off guard because he'd never seen her face do that before. He laughed too. He didn't plan to. It simply happened. And it lasted longer than it needed to, in the way of laughter shared between people who have been too serious for too long in a small space. And when it was done, there was something different in the room, something that had shifted and was not going to shift back. He helped her reassemble the tripod, which took 20 minutes and required a specific sequence that only revealed itself through trial and error, and 2 more failed attempts that produced 2 more shorter laughs. And when they were done, the instrument was standing and probably still not accurate, but upright at least, which felt like sufficient victory. "What were you actually trying to measure?" he asked. The roof pitch, she said. I think the east side is lower than the west. It might be why it holds more snow load. He considered this. He sat back on his heels and looked at the east wall. You know, he said slowly, I think you're right. I can't actually verify it without. I'll check it tomorrow, he said. I've been meaning to look at the east joists anyway. She nodded, and they both looked at the tripod, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the room was easy in a way that rooms are easy only when the people in them have stopped performing for each other. By March, the first suggestions of thaw appeared. Not warmth exactly, but a change in the quality of cold, a slight softening at the edges of the hardest days. The snow on the south slope began to release in small amounts in the afternoon sun, and the sound of it was a new sound in the acoustic landscape of the mountain, a tentative dripping and settling that felt like the season preparing to say something it hadn't said yet. They went out together on the trap line for the first time at the start of the month. He'd taken her on shorter sections before, teaching her the tracks, the signs, the way to read snow for information. But this was the full eastern line, 12 miles in a long loop through the valley and back. A full day. She kept up without difficulty. He'd stopped being surprised by that. They were moving through a section of dense spruce, following a frozen creek bed, when she stopped suddenly and put her hand on his arm. He stopped, looked where she was looking. A red fox, 20 yards ahead, standing on a snow-covered log with a stillness that suggested it had been there longer than they'd realized, and had been watching them for some time. It was watching them now with the slightly offended expression that foxes habitually wore, as if the world consistently failed to meet their standards. They stood without moving for a long moment. The fox considered them further, decided they were not worth continuing to observe, and stepped off the log and disappeared into the spruce with a fluency that made the woods seem briefly liquid. Eleanor let out a slow breath. She was still looking at the place where the fox had been. I've never seen one that close, she said. They're bolder in late winter, he said. Hungry. It was beautiful. He glanced at her. She said it the way his father had written things, directly, without apology, without the self-conscious qualification that people sometimes added to softer observations, as if they needed to apologize for noticing beauty. He thought about what she'd said about his father's journals. He said everything to her, everything he loved. He looked back at the spruce. There's a den about a quarter-mile east, he said. If we're quiet on the way back, we might see the whole family. She looked at him. You know where the fox den is? I know where most things are up here, he said. You just have to pay attention long enough. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, something warmer. Then she looked back at the trail. Show me, she said. They walked on through the cold spruce morning, their boots quiet in the deep snow. And he did. The riders appeared on the third morning of March. Riker was on the roof checking the east joists when he saw them at the edge of the property. 4 horses, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew where they were going and weren't in a hurry about it. He watched them for a moment from up high, shading his eyes against the morning glare off the snow. Something was wrong with the configuration of them. 1 man out front, civilian clothes, expensive horse. 3 behind, wearing the particular kind of coat that suggested official function. He was down off the roof and inside before they reached the fence line. Eleanor was at the table. She looked up when he came in fast. Riders, he said. 4 of them. One of them is Granger. He watched her face go through something. Not panic. She didn't panic, he'd established that firmly. But something moved through her expression, a recognition and a bracing, like a person who has been expecting bad weather and is not surprised to see it arriving, only regretful that the good days are over. Eleanor, he said. She looked at him steadily. Her hands were flat on the table. I know who the others are, she said. I think. Tell me. She opened her mouth, closed it. The sound of horses outside came through the wall, the creak of saddle leather, the muffled stamp of hooves in snow. I'll tell you everything, she said. I promise you that. But right now I need to know. She stopped. Something crossed her face that was more exposed than anything he'd seen from her before. Do you trust me? He stood there for one long beat. He thought about 3 days without sleep, and the sound of her voice in the dark and elk quarters carried 2 miles through winter wilderness, and a repaired coat and a fixed broken tripod. And the way she'd said I came back as if that was the most important thing she could tell him. He thought about all of that. Yes, he said. Someone knocked on the cabin door. Riker opened the door. Silas Granger stood on the other side of it, wearing his good coat and his banker's smile, the one that never quite reached his small blue eyes. Behind him, 3 men sat their horses in the yard with the patient, in different posture of men who are paid to wait and are comfortable doing it. 2 wore the long dark coats of federal agents. The third Riker didn't recognize, a lean, sharp-faced man in city clothes who was watching the cabin with an attention that felt different from the others, more personal. "Riker," Granger said warmly, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. "Forgive the intrusion. I should have sent word ahead, but the trail's been unpredictable." "What do you want, Silas?" The warmth in Granger's expression adjusted by a fraction, not disappearing, just recalibrating. "A conversation. May we come in?" "You can talk from there." A brief pause. Granger glanced back at the agents, then returned his attention to Riker with the expression of a man who has decided to be patient about something he finds mildly inconvenient. "All right," he said. "I'll be direct then. The woman you married, Eleanor Vale, is wanted for questioning in connection with a federal investigation. These gentlemen are here in an official capacity." He indicated the 2 agents with a small gesture. "We'd like to speak with her." "About what?" "Railroad bonds. Stolen from the Continental Railroad offices in Chicago 2 years ago. A significant sum." He paused. "Eleanor was employed there at the time. She left, rather abruptly, shortly after the theft was discovered." Riker didn't move. He didn't look back at Eleanor, though he was acutely aware of her presence behind him in the cabin. "You're saying my wife stole railroad bonds?" "I'm saying she's wanted for questioning," Granger said, and the distinction in his voice was the kind that meant very little in practice. "If she has nothing to hide, the conversation will be brief and she'll be free to return." He smiled again. "I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding." The lean man on the third horse spoke then, and his voice had a Chicago flatness to it, a quality of compressed impatience. "We can do this simply, or we can do it with paperwork, Mr. Boone. Either way, we're taking her down the mountain today." Riker looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know you." "My name is Agent Prentice, federal investigator." "Prentice," Riker repeated as if cataloging it. "You rode 4 hours up a mountain in March snow to question a woman about a 2-year-old theft. That's correct? That's a lot of effort for a questioning." Something moved behind Prentice's eyes, a brief flicker of something that wasn't quite patience. "Mr. Boone, she's not going anywhere today," Riker said. He said it the same way he said most things, without particular heat, but with the finality of a man stating a fact about geography. "If you have legal papers, show them to me. If you don't, ride back down the mountain and come back with them." Granger's smile had thinned considerably. "Riker, I'd encourage you not to." "You encouraged me to marry her," Riker said. "I did that. Now you're telling me she's wanted by federal agents. So either you knew that when you made the arrangement, in which case you have a lot to answer for, or you didn't know, in which case you have no standing here at all." He held Granger's gaze. "Which is it?" A silence. The horses shifted in the cold. Granger looked at Riker with the expression of a man recalculating a sum that has come out wrong. "We'll return tomorrow," Prentice said flatly, "with papers." "Then I'll see you tomorrow," Riker said. He closed the door. He stood facing the closed door for a moment, listening to the sound of horses turning and moving away through the snow, and then he turned around. Eleanor was standing in the center of the room. Her arms were at her sides. Her face was the careful, contained face she'd worn on that first day in the boarding house parlor. The face she put on when she was managing something too large to let show all at once. "I need you to tell me everything," Riker said. "Right now. All of it." She nodded once. She sat down at the table, and she told him. It took the better part of an hour. She spoke without self-pity, without excessive qualification, in the same direct way she did most things, and he sat across from her and listened the way she had taught him, without interrupting, without reacting to each piece as it arrived. He owed her that at least. The bones of it were these. 2 years ago, Eleanor had been working as a senior bookkeeper for the Continental Railroad's Chicago offices, a position she'd held for 4 years, good at it, trusted with sensitive records. Her younger sister, Clara, had been involved with a man named Victor Hale. Eleanor had tried to warn Clara about him from the beginning. Victor Hale was charming and well-dressed and moved in the right circles and was, beneath all of that, a calculating and genuinely dangerous person. Hale had used Clara to access the railroad's internal transfer codes, not through force, but through manipulation, the slow, patient kind that leaves no bruises and is therefore harder to name. Clara hadn't understood what she was handing over until it was done. By the time Eleanor found out, $40,000 in railroad bonds had been rerouted through 3 shell accounts, and Hale was in the process of making himself scarce. The railroad's investigators moved fast. Clara was going to be arrested, charged, prosecuted. She was 22 years old and had genuinely not understood the full nature of what she'd participated in. The case against her was solid enough that her ignorance would have mattered very little. Eleanor had made a choice. She told him this part slowly. I had access to the original transaction records, she said. I knew how the transfers had been structured. I knew which documents would need to be altered to shift the liability. She looked at her hands on the table. I forged 3 internal transfer authorizations and 1 accounting record. I made it look like I had initiated the bond transfers, not Clara. I made the evidence point to me instead. Riker was quiet. Then I left Chicago, she said, before they could arrest me. I knew they'd come eventually. I just needed... She stopped, started again. Clara is in Cleveland now. She's married. She has a daughter. She doesn't know what I did. She thinks the case went cold. She looked up at him. I couldn't let her spend 20 years in a federal prison for something that was done to her. He sat with this for a long moment. He thought about what it meant to know, in advance, that you were going to pay for something that wasn't your fault. To plan it, to execute it, to run. He thought about the composure she'd arrived with, the plain dark coat, the trunk she'd carried herself, the total absence of self-pity. He understood it differently now. Victor Hale, he said. Where is he? Her expression shifted. That's the part I haven't told you yet, she said. That's the part that makes this worse. She reached under the table and pulled out a small wooden box. He recognized it as one that had been in her trunk, which he'd never touched. Inside it was a ledger. Old, worn at the binding, its pages dense with columns of figures and coded notations. I took this before I left Chicago, she said. From Hale's private office. I had a key. Long story. She set it on the table between them. This isn't just about the railroad bonds. The bonds were one transaction. This ledger records 5 years of transactions. Money stolen from 4 different railroad companies, funneled through front businesses, and distributed to the men who helped make it possible. She looked at him steadily. Silas Granger is in this ledger, Riker. Multiple entries over 3 years. He wasn't just aware of what Hale was doing. He was a partner in it. The room was very quiet. Granger knew about you, Riker said slowly. When he arranged the marriage, he knew who you were. He must have found out I was in Cutter's Ridge, she said. If I disappeared again, it would create questions. If I was legally married and settled and living on a mountain, documented, registered, officially unremarkable, I was contained, not a threat. She paused. I think he assumed I didn't have the ledger anymore, or that I wouldn't use it. Riker stood up. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the property. The snow, the barn, the pine line. The trail Granger and his men had ridden back down. Prentice, he said, the federal agent. Is he legitimate? I don't know, she said honestly. He might be, or Granger might have found a way to use him. With enough money and the right connections. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. He turned back around. Why didn't you tell me? It wasn't an accusation. He meant it as a genuine question, and she heard it that way. Because I didn't know if you'd make me leave, she said. At first, and then, she looked at the table. Then I didn't want to take something away from what was happening here. I kept telling myself I'd tell you when the time was right, and the time kept not being right, and... She stopped. That was a mistake. I'm sorry. He came back to the table but didn't sit. He stood at the end of it, looking at the ledger, then at her face. The real one. The one underneath the composure, where something exhausted and frightened and determined all existed at the same time. You were protecting your sister, he said. I was. And now the man you took that ledger from is outside with federal agents. Yes. And if Granger gets you off this mountain and Hale is anywhere in that arrangement, neither of us is going to like how that ends. She held his gaze. No, she said quietly. We're not. He looked at the ledger again. He picked it up, opened it to a random page, columns of figures, dates, initials he didn't recognize. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the record-keeping of someone who'd believed they were untouchable. This is real evidence, he said. It's enough to prosecute both of them, she said, if it reaches the right people. And who are the right people? Not Prentice, she said. If Granger controls him, there's a federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. Marshal Cord Davies. I've heard his name from people I trust. He has no connection to the Continental Railroad contracts. If this ledger reaches him directly, Davies, Riker said. He knew the name, vaguely. A man with a reputation that had survived contact with reality, which was rarer than it should have been. Cheyenne is 2 days' ride. I know. He set the ledger down and looked at her for a long moment. He was angry, not at her exactly, but at the situation, at Granger, at the shape of what had been done to her and what was now being done again. He was also running underneath the anger like a current, deeply, irrationally proud of her. He wasn't sure he was going to tell her that. They'll be back tomorrow, he said. Yes. With papers or without them, Prentice and his men have rifles and legal standing, and Granger has whatever leverage he's bought. He looked at the window. If we're still here when they come back, we're playing on their ground. Then we can't be here, she said, or the ledger can't be. He nodded slowly. He was already running the mathematics of it, the trails, the timing, the options. There weren't many, and the one that made sense was also the most dangerous. But then, most of the options on this mountain were like that. Tell me about your sister, he said. It came from a different place than the tactical thinking, from somewhere he didn't try to explain. What's she like? Eleanor looked at him, a quick, surprised look, as if the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. She's nothing like me, she said. She laughs easily. She trusts people too quickly, always has. A pause. She sends me letters when she can. She doesn't know my address, but she sends them to a post office in Denver, and I pick them up when I can get there. Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite grief, but was adjacent to it, the sound of someone describing a distance they didn't choose. Her daughter's name is May. I've never met her. The fire in the grate was burning low. Outside, the light was going gray and long, the particular late afternoon light of early March, when the days were starting to find their length again. Somewhere on the north ridge, distantly, a wolf called once. Riker moved to the fire and added wood. You're going to meet her, he said. Eleanor didn't say anything. May, he said. Your sister's daughter. You're going to meet her. He straightened up and looked at her over his shoulder. That's not a sentiment. That's a plan. We need to move on this tonight. Something moved through her face that she didn't try to stop. Something unguarded and real that he'd seen only a handful of times, each time feeling like a window opening in a closed room. She pressed her lips together for a moment, composed herself. What are you thinking? She asked. He turned fully from the fire. His left shoulder still pulled where the bear had torn it, would probably pull for the rest of his life on cold mornings. He didn't mind it much. It reminded him of what held. I'm thinking, he said, that Granger made a mistake when he put you on this mountain. He thought he was containing you. He looked at the ledger on the table. He didn't account for the fact that I know every trail off this mountain in the dark. In a blizzard. In worse than tonight. He picked up the ledger and held it. He doesn't know this ground. I do. He looked at her. Go through the trunk, he said. Take only what you need. Nothing that slows the horse. He moved toward his coat and his rifle. I'm going to check the trail conditions before the light goes completely. She stood. Riker. He paused. She was standing by the table, and her composure was intact but only just, and the exhaustion underneath it was visible now in a way it hadn't been since the fever nights. That bone-deep weariness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for so long, they've forgotten what their arms feel like empty. I am sorry, she said, for not telling you sooner. I know that doesn't... Eleanor, he said. His voice came out rougher than he planned. You carried your sister's sentence for 2 years and ran to the edge of the country and then dragged my half-dead carcass out of a snowfield. He held her gaze. You don't owe me an apology. You owe me the truth, and you've given me that. A pause. That's enough. She looked at him for a long moment. Something settled in her face. Not relief exactly, but something that had been braced against impact and was now cautiously releasing. All right, she said. All right, he said, and went to check the trail. I was gone 40 minutes, long enough to go as far as the second ridge and read the snow conditions and come back with the full picture in his head. The trail off the north side was manageable, barely, but manageable. The main trail down to Cutter's Ridge was the obvious route, and therefore the one Granger would expect, and the one they couldn't use. But there was another way off the mountain, longer by 6 miles, through a canyon that was brutal in deep winter and entirely manageable in early March thaw. It came out 2 miles east of town, near the old Harmon relay station. He came back to the cabin to find Eleanor ready. She'd done exactly what he'd said: a small pack, practical clothing, nothing wasted. The ledger was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her coat. She'd also, he noticed, left the fire burning and arranged the cabin to look occupied. Coat on the hook by the door, boots by the grate, his father's journal open on the table. If anyone looked through the window in the dark, they'd see the fire and the stillness of a cabin at rest. He looked at the arrangement, then at her. "Buy us time in the morning," she said simply. He thought, she is better at this than I am. He didn't say that either. He picked up his rifle, checked the action, slung it across his back. "Stay close on the north trail," he said. "There's ice under the snow at the second switchback. I'll tell you when we're at it." She nodded. "If something happens and we get separated, Harmon Relay Station," she said, 2 miles east of town. He hadn't told her that yet. He stared at her. "You drew it on the map last month," she said. "Old route." I remembered. He held her gaze for one moment. He thought about the fox den, and the reorganized supply shelf, and the woman who had learned this mountain like it belonged to her because she had needed somewhere to belong. "Let's go," he said. They slipped out the back of the cabin into the cold March dark, and behind them the fire burned on in an empty room, and the mountain closed around them both like a hand. The north trail at night, in early March, was not the same trail it was in daylight. It was narrower, meaner, the ice patches invisible under a thin skin of fresh snow that made every step a negotiation. Riker went first, testing the ground before committing his weight, and Eleanor followed 3 feet behind him with a steadiness that he felt rather than saw in the dark. The sound of her breathing, the controlled placement of her boots, the absence of complaint. They didn't talk on the trail. Sound carried in mountain cold in ways that were difficult to predict, and Granger's men had made camp somewhere below the property line. He'd seen the distant orange point of their fire from the second ridge. How much distance that fire represented in the dark, he couldn't be certain. At the second switchback, he stopped and put his hand back without turning around. She stopped immediately. He crouched and ran his fingers along the snow surface until he felt the hardness underneath. A shelf of ice running the full width of the trail, maybe 15 feet of it. He stood and moved to the left edge, where a strip of packed snow hugged the rock face. He went across first, his right hand trailing against the cold stone for balance, and made it without incident. He turned and held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. They crossed together. Her grip was firm, and she didn't lean on him. She was using the contact for information, not for support. When they were across, she released his hand without ceremony, and they kept moving. An hour and a half in, with the canyon trail dropping steeply below them and the worst of it behind, she said quietly, "You're favoring the left shoulder." He was. The cold had gotten into the old wound the way cold always did now, a deep grinding ache that started at the scar and worked outward. He'd been managing it without thinking about it. "It's fine," he said. "I know it's fine," she said. "I'm just noting it." He almost smiled at that in the dark. They reached the canyon floor at close to midnight. The going was easier here, broader ground, the snow more consolidated, the walls of the canyon cutting the wind. Their horses moved better out of the broken terrain and picked up a rhythm. Above them the sky had cleared and the stars were extraordinary in the way they only were at altitude in cold air, the Milky Way a visible smear across the black. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Eleanor said, "When this is over, if it ends well—" She paused. "What do you want?" The question surprised him, not because it was inappropriate, but because nobody had asked him that in a very long time. "What do I want?" he repeated. "Yes." He thought about it honestly. "The land," he said. "The mountain. I want to not owe anything to anyone." He paused. "That's all I've ever wanted, really." "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." A beat. "What do you want?" She was quiet for a moment. I thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she said, "I want to stop running. I want to send Clara a letter that has a real address on it." She paused. "I want to meet May." He nodded in the dark. They rode on. The Harmon relay station was a half-collapsed structure that had served the old stage route before the railroad made it irrelevant. 2 rooms of rough timber, a broken stove, a roof that was mostly intact over the east room. They arrived before first light, cold and stiff, and got the horses into the partial shelter of the remaining lean-to. There was old hay in a feed box, dry enough to be usable. The horses didn't complain. Inside, Riker got a small fire going in the broken stove, enough to cut the cold, not enough to produce visible smoke from a distance. Eleanor sat on an overturned crate and unwrapped the ledger from its oilcloth and opened it on her knees, not reading it, but checking it, running her thumb along the pages to confirm they were dry and undamaged from the ride. Cheyenne, Riker said. Davies. Yes, that's 2 days, possibly more if the road south is bad. I know. He crouched in front of the small fire and looked at it. I'm not taking you to Cheyenne, he said. She looked up. I need you to stay here while I go, he said. He held up one hand before she could speak. Not because you can't make the ride. Because if Granger figures out we left the mountain last night and starts looking, he'll look for 2 riders. One rider headed south toward Cheyenne, one person staying hidden in a relay station. That's harder to find and harder to intercept. He met her eyes. And because if Granger intends for this to end badly, I don't want you in the same location as the Ledger and me at the same time. If something goes wrong on the road, the Ledger still needs to reach Davies. She was quiet, thinking through it. He watched her face work over the logic and come to the same conclusion he had. And the moment she arrived at it, he could see it. A slight tension around the eyes, not disagreement, just the cost of acceptance. How long? She asked. 3 days, maybe 4. He paused. There's a woman in town, Vera Hutchins, runs the millinery on the east end of Main Street. If something goes wrong and you need help before I'm back, go to her. Tell her Riker Boone sent you. She knew my father. Vera Hutchins, Eleanor repeated, storing it. There's food in the saddlebag. Not much, but enough. Keep the fire small. He stood. Don't go back up the mountain unless you have to. She looked at him for a moment with that steady attention. Be careful on the south road, she said. Not for my sake, for yours. Those aren't different things, he said, and it came out before he decided to say it. She held his gaze for one long beat. Something moved between them in the cold quiet of the relay station. Not a moment of resolution or conclusion, nothing that could be named cleanly, just the acknowledgement that they had arrived somewhere neither of them had expected to arrive and neither of them wanted to leave. He picked up his rifle in his pack. He walked to the door, then stopped. Eleanor. Yes, he turned halfway. When I come back, he said, we're going to talk about what happens next. All of it. Not what has to happen, what we want to happen. He paused. Is that all right with you? She looked at him with something open in her face that he'd never seen from her in quite that form. Not the careful composure, not the managed steadiness, but something underneath all of that, something that had been there the whole time and was now simply looking back at him directly. Yes, she said. That's all right with me. He went out into the cold pre-dawn and rode south. Cutter's Ridge woke slowly on March mornings, the main street gray and mostly empty until the saloon and the general store opened and gave people reasons to emerge. Riker came in from the east, bypassing the main street entirely, moving along the back lots behind the buildings until he reached the livery where he kept a second horse in town. A line-back dun he used for supply runs, steadier on roads than the mountain horses. He transferred the Ledger to his inner coat and switched horses and was back on the road south before the town had fully decided to be awake. He had been riding for 4 hours, putting distance between himself and Cutter's Ridge with a steady focus, when the thing he'd half expected happened. 2 riders appeared on the road ahead, coming north toward him, moving fast. He recognized Prentice's horse before he recognized the man. The expensive bay, the city-bred horse that had no business moving at that speed on a rutted March road. Beside him, the lean man in city clothes that Riker had placed as Hale's associate and now reconsidered as Hale himself. Moving toward him with the particular energy of men who have been told something and are acting on it. They knew he'd left the mountain. Someone in Cutter's Ridge, the livery, possibly, or someone who'd seen him on the East Road, had passed the word. He had maybe 30 seconds before they closed the distance. Riker pulled his horse off the road to the right, into the tree line, fast and quiet. The horse went without protest. The dun was a sensible animal, a town horse, but a good one, and it read his urgency and matched it. He went 30 feet into the timber and stopped, watching the road through the trees. Prentice and the other man came past at a gallop, looking ahead down the road, not at the tree line. They were moving too fast to catch peripheral motion. They went past, and their hoofbeats faded north. Riker waited 4 minutes, then he came back out and rode south, harder now. He pushed the dun through the afternoon without mercy and made Laramie by evening, a hard-ridden 7 hours that left the horse spent, and him not much better. He ate fast at a road inn, got the horse watered and fed, and slept 3 hours on a cot in the stable with his rifle across his chest, because that was faster than finding a room. He was back on the road before dawn. He reached the outskirts of Cheyenne by midday on the second day. The federal marshal's office was on a side street off the main avenue. A solid frame building, flag out front, the particular look of a government structure that has been occupied long enough to develop a personality. Riker tied his horse and went inside with the ledger in his coat and mud on his boots, and the general appearance of a man who has been riding very hard for reasons he hasn't slept enough to explain gracefully. The deputy at the front desk was a young man who looked at Riker with the expression of a person processing several concerns simultaneously. "Marshal Davies," Riker said. "It's urgent." "The marshals—" "Get him," Riker said. "Tell him Silas Granger and Victor Hale. He'll come out." The deputy came back in 2 minutes with a man behind him who was nothing like what Riker had pictured. Cord Davies was in his late 40s, compact and deliberate-looking, with a weathered face and the quiet of a man who has learned that most things people say are less important than how they look when they say it. He assessed Riker in 3 seconds with eyes that had seen a great many men in varying states of urgency. "Come in," he said. The conversation in Davies' office lasted 2 hours. Riker laid it out straight, no embellishment, no performance. Just the sequence of events from Granger's dead arrangement through Eleanor's confession, through the ledger and the riders on the mountain. He set the ledger on the desk and watched Davies open it and go through it with a methodical attention that told him the man was not encountering these names for the first time. "Granger," Davies said, not looking up from the ledger. "You know him. We've had his name in connection with 2 other investigations. Couldn't establish a direct link." He turned a page. "This is direct." He looked up. "And your wife took this from Hale's office herself." "She did." "She's currently safe," Riker said. "For now. But if Granger figures out where she is—" "Understood." Davies closed the ledger and sat back and looked at Riker with the quiet assessment that seemed to be his default register. "I'm going to need to move quickly on this. If Granger has Prentice in his pocket and Prentice gets back to him and tells him you came south, then he knows the ledger is heading to someone with authority, which changes the situation from a legal matter to a liability management matter." Davies said it plainly, without drama. "For men like Granger, those are very different problems with very different solutions." "Eleanor," Riker said. Davies was already standing. "Give me an hour," he said. What followed was not a clean operation. Riker learned later that it was, by any institutional measure, chaotic. A federal action assembled in under 2 hours, with Davies pulling 4 deputies and contacting 2 other jurisdictions by telegraph and riding north toward Cutter's Ridge, with a speed that the marshal's office would later describe in official language as expedient response to credible immediate threat. Riker was with them because Davies had decided, with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who doesn't waste useful resources, that a man who knew the mountain and the players and had 2 days of accumulated anger was more valuable present than absent. They made Cutter's Ridge in the early evening of the second day, and the first thing Riker understood as they came down the main street was that the situation had moved. The First Territorial Bank had its front door standing open in a way that meant either commerce or crisis, and the sound coming from inside it suggested the latter. He heard the shot before Davies raised his hand for a halt. Then another. Riker was off his horse before the echo had finished. Inside the bank, it was glass and smoke, and the particular disorientation of a space that has just experienced violence and hasn't finished processing it. A clerk was behind an overturned desk. 2 of Granger's men were in the front room, one down and one trying to be somewhere else very quickly. In the back, where the vault and Granger's office were, the sounds of a struggle that was winding down. Riker went through the front room fast, stepping over the man on the floor, reaching the back corridor. Victor Hale was behind Granger's desk. He was not what Riker had imagined. Not large, not physically imposing, just a man in a good suit with quick, calculating eyes, and the hands of someone who had always let other people handle the physical difficulties. Those hands were holding a pistol that was pointing at something to Riker's left, and when Riker came through the door, the eyes moved to him with a rapid, assessing intelligence. Boone, Hale said. He'd done his research. Where is she? She's not here, Riker said. He had the rifle up. His shoulder burned. He kept the rifle up. The ledger. Also not here, Riker said. It's already where it needed to go. Something shifted in Hale's face, a calculation failing, a column of figures that had just come out wrong. He was fast about recovering from it. Riker gave him that. The gun didn't waver. You have nothing, Hale said. Even with the ledger. Her word against mine. A woman who forged federal documents. A mountain trapper with no... Victor Hale. Davies' voice came from behind Riker, level and official, and carrying the particular authority of a man who has said this sentence before and knows exactly how it lands. Federal warrant. Set it down. A pause that lasted longer than it should have. Then slowly, Hale set it down. Granger was found in the vault room 15 minutes later, attempting a thing that was both predictable and pointless, destroying papers that had already been superseded by the ledger's contents. Davies's deputies had him in handcuffs before he finished. When they brought Granger through the front room, past Riker, the banker looked at him with those small blue eyes, and for the first time since Riker had known him, the calculation behind them was gone. What was left was older and uglier and somehow smaller. I made you a fair arrangement, Granger said. Riker looked at him. You made yourself one, he said. Those aren't the same thing. Davies came up beside Riker while the deputies processed the scene. He looked around at the glass and the disorder and the paperwork scattered across the floor. Your wife, he said. Relay station east of town, you said. Yes. I'll need her statement, and I'll need to review her specific situation with our office in Chicago. He looked at Riker. The forgery charges are real. I won't pretend otherwise. I know, but the context of them, Davies paused, and the fact that she handed us 5 years of evidence and the primary architect of all of it. He paused again, which felt like a man choosing words that would hold their shape later. I can't promise outcomes, but I can tell you that context matters in these proceedings. Cooperation matters. He looked at Riker directly. She deserves a real hearing. I'll make sure she gets one. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't close to one. It was the honest assessment of a man who knew his limits, and it was, Riker thought, the best thing he'd been offered in a long time. He shook Davies' hand. Then he went to get his horse. He rode east out of Cutter's Ridge as the last of the evening light lay flat and orange across the snow, the sky above it going deep blue at the edges. The road was familiar under the Dun's hooves. His shoulder ached. He was tired in the complete way of a person who has used up most of what they had and is running on the remaining portion. He reached the relay station as the stars were coming out. He saw the light in the east room window from 50 yards out, the small, careful fire she'd been maintaining, and something unknotted in his chest that he hadn't fully acknowledged was knotted. He dismounted outside and walked to the door and opened it. Eleanor looked up from the crate where she was sitting. She had the notebook in her hands, the one with the bird records, and the wind directions, and the careful map of a mountain she'd spent a winter learning. She'd been writing in it. Her face in the firelight was composed and exhausted, and when she saw him, something else entirely. She stood up. He looked at her across the small room. He thought about everything he'd meant to say. The practical things, the legal situation, Davies and the warrant, and the uncertain path ahead. All of it was true, and all of it needed saying. But first he crossed the room in 3 steps and put his arms around her, careful of the left shoulder and not particularly caring about it, and she put her face against his chest, and they stood there in the half-dark of a half-ruined building on the edge of a mountain they both belonged to. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there wasn't anything that needed saying more than that. She pulled back eventually and looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't a person who cried easily, and he didn't expect her to be. The ledger? She said. Davies has it. Granger and Hale are in custody. He held her gaze. You're going to have to give a statement. There's a hearing process. It's not simple, and I won't tell you it is. She nodded. She'd been through enough not to need the world dressed up. Davies said context matters, Riker said. And cooperation. He'll make sure you get a real hearing. That's more than I had yesterday, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him for a moment. You rode to Cheyenne and back in 2 days and walked into a gunfight. The gunfight was mostly over when I arrived, he said. Riker. I told you the ledger needed to reach the right person, he said. I meant it. She looked at him with that expression, the open one, the one underneath everything else. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw for a moment, just briefly, and he covered it with his before she could pull it back. Outside, the wind moved quietly through the canyon. The stars were brilliant and cold and indifferent, the way they always were. And somewhere above them both the mountain waited in the dark, permanent and unchanged, holding the cabin and the graves and the trap lines and everything that had happened in the long winter between two strangers who had stopped being that. Let's go home, she said. He let go of her hand, picked up his rifle, and held the door. They rode back up the mountain in the dark, and it was not easy, and it was not quick, and there was nothing cinematic about it. Just two tired people on tired horses navigating a trail they both knew by different kinds of memory, the cold working at them from all sides, the dun blowing hard on the steep sections. Riker's shoulder had stiffened badly from the riding, and the cold and whatever had happened in the bank, and he moved it carefully, consciously, the way you manage something you know is going to hurt regardless of how careful you are. Eleanor rode behind him without complaint. He could hear her breathing in the hard sections. At the second switchback, the ice shelf they'd crossed in darkness 2 nights ago, she dismounted without being asked and led her horse across on foot, the same strip of packed snow along the rock face, her hand trailing the stone. She'd remembered exactly. They reached the cabin just before midnight. The fire Eleanor had left burning 2 days ago had burned down to cold ash. The cabin was frigid, the kind of cold that has had time to settle into the walls and the floor and the furniture and intends to stay. Riker got a new fire going while Eleanor tended the horses. She went to the barn without discussion, knowing that was what needed doing, and he heard the familiar sounds through the wall, the horses settling, the water, the hay. I was sitting at the table with his coat still on when she came back in. She looked at the fire, then at him. Your shoulder, she said. It's all right. It's not, she said. She went to the shelf where the medical supplies lived. She'd reorganized those too, weeks ago, everything labeled and within reach, and came back to the table with the kit and sat down across from him. Take the coat off. He took it off. She checked the old wound with the same hands that had stitched it 3 months ago, careful and thorough and entirely without drama. The skin had pulled but not torn. The ache was deep muscle, the kind that needed rest more than anything else. Nothing new, she said. Just angry. Story of my life, he said. She looked at him. He hadn't meant it to be funny, and it wasn't particularly, but something in the delivery made the corner of her mouth move, and he felt the tiredness in him shift slightly, the way it does when you're with someone who makes even the hard things a fraction lighter. She put the kit away. They ate. Cold food, nothing elaborate, neither of them with the energy for more. They sat at the table afterward in the growing warmth of the fire and didn't talk for a while, which was a different kind of quiet from the early silences of the marriage. That first quiet had been the quiet of two people being careful with each other, measuring the distance. This was the quiet of people who have been through something together and are resting inside it. I keep thinking about the hearing, Eleanor said finally. I know. Davies said context matters. I know what that means, and I also know what it doesn't mean. She was looking at the fire. Her hands were flat on the table. I forged federal documents. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a thing I did. You did it to protect your sister from a man who manipulated her. Yes. And a federal court will weigh that against the actual crime, and I don't know what that weighs out to. She paused. I've been running from it for 2 years. I'm tired of running. She looked at him. I want to stop. Whatever the outcome is, I want to face it and stop. He looked at her across the table. He thought about what it cost to say that. Not just the words, but the surrender underneath them, the willingness to stop controlling the one variable she'd been managing for 2 years by staying ahead of it. That was not a small thing. He'd spent years on a mountain managing his own grief by keeping the world at a sufficient distance, and he understood what it took to choose the opposite. You won't face it alone, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. You don't have to. Eleanor. His voice was patient and final at the same time. I know I don't have to. That's been established. I'm telling you that I'm going to. She looked at him for a long moment with that expression he'd come to know better than most things on the mountain, the one where the composure and the real person underneath it were visible at the same time, layered over each other like two transparencies. Then she nodded once, and that was enough. The letter to Davies arrived 3 weeks later, carried up by a rider from Cutter's Ridge. Formal language, federal letterhead, the particular architecture of official communication designed to convey precise meaning without emotional register. Riker watched Eleanor read it at the table. He watched her face go through something that was difficult to interpret from the outside. A sequence of small adjustments, a tightening and then a release. The expression of someone receiving news. They have been waiting for long enough that the waiting has become its own kind of armor, and the armor takes a moment to come down. She set the letter flat on the table. Eleanor, he said. The Chicago office reviewed the full case, she said. Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are being held steady by effort. In light of the evidence provided by the ledger and the testimony regarding Victor Hale's use of Clara as a means of accessing the transfer codes, she paused. The forgery charges have been reduced to a single count with time served given the 2 years of voluntary exile and the material cooperation with the federal investigation. She looked up. Davies argued for it personally. It says so. What does that mean in practice? It means a record, she said. A formal record that I can't make disappear. And a fine. She almost laughed, a short, exhaled sound that was more relief than humor. A fine I can't currently pay. But a record and a fine, not... She stopped. Not prison. He understood. He got up from the bench and came around the table, and she stood up at the same moment, which he hadn't expected. And he put his arms around her, and this time she let herself lean into it in a way she hadn't before. Not collapse, not weakness, just the genuine physical acknowledgement of a weight being set down. She was shaking slightly, just slightly. He held on. After a moment she said against his shoulder, I need to write to Clara. Yes, he said. You do. I don't know how to explain any of this in a letter. Start with, I'm all right, he said. The rest can come after that. She pulled back and looked at him with wet eyes that she blinked clear with the particular efficiency of a woman who does not enjoy crying in front of people and is managing it. That's actually good advice, she said. I have moments, he said. Spring on the mountain was not a gentle thing. It was messy and complicated and arrived in the wrong order. 3 warm days followed by a late snowstorm, followed by fog, followed by a morning of such brilliant, clear light that the whole mountain looked newly made. The snow running off the south slopes in thin, bright rivulets that fed the creek and sent it up against its banks with a sound like continuous conversation. Riker fixed the east roof joists in the second week of April, the ones Eleanor had correctly identified back in February with the surveying tripod. She had been right. The pitch on the east side was shallow by about 4 degrees, enough to explain the differential snow load he'd been dealing with for years, and accepting as simply how things were. He shimmied the rafters while she handed him tools from below, and when he came down off the ladder, she was already measuring the adjacent section with a string line and a level borrowed from his father's surveying kit. The overhang here is short by about 8 inches, she said without looking up. I know, he said. I've been meaning to extend it. I can help with that. He looked at her. You can help with that. She looked up from the string line. I helped you build the woodshed extension in February. This isn't more complicated than that. He thought about the woodshed extension, which had been her idea, and which had added meaningful storage space, and which he now could not imagine the property without. Fair point, he said. She went back to the string line. He watched her for a moment. The focus, the practicality, the complete comfort in her own competence that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. She'd simply decided to learn this place, and she had, with the same systematic attention she applied to everything. He thought about what the town had said about her before the winter. Cursed. Bad luck. A woman who brought ruin wherever she went. He thought about Silas Granger's small, careful smile, and the word contained and what it meant for a man like that to look at a woman like Eleanor Vale and see a problem to be managed. They'd all seen the same person and understood nothing about her. What are you looking at? She said, not looking up. The roof overhang, he said. Liar, she said. He smiled. He didn't try to hide it. The letter from Clara arrived in May. It came in an envelope that had been forwarded 3 times, first to the Denver post office, where Eleanor had rerouted her correspondence to Cutter's Ridge once she'd had an address she trusted. It was thick. Clara had apparently had a great deal to say. Eleanor sat on the porch steps in the afternoon sun and read it twice. Riker was splitting wood at the block 20 feet away, and he kept working, giving her the space of it, watching her peripherally the way you watch a fire. Not staring, just keeping awareness. When she looked up, he stopped. "She's coming in July," Eleanor said. Her voice had something in it that he'd never heard before, a fullness, like a room that's been empty for a long time and has just had the windows opened. Her and her husband, and May. He set the axe down. "July," he said. "Is that—" She stopped. A pause that meant something. "Is that all right? The cabin isn't—" "We'll make room," he said. "It's not a large cabin." "Eleanor." He walked over and sat down on the porch steps beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, which neither of them made a point of. "We survived the worst winter in 20 years in that cabin. We can survive a visit from your sister." She looked at the letter in her hands. He could see Clara's handwriting from here, large and looping, the handwriting of someone who hadn't learned to be economical with space, the opposite of Eleanor's small, precise script. "She says May is almost 3, Eleanor said. "She says May talks constantly and has a strong opinion about everything." She paused. "She says—" Her voice shifted slightly. "She says she's sorry it took so long to find me, that she's been sending letters to Denver for 2 years hoping I'd get them." "She didn't know where you were." "No." Eleanor folded the letter along its original creases. "She says she always knew I hadn't done it, what I was accused of." A pause. "She says she suspected for a long time what really happened, that I'd protected her. She says she—" She stopped. "She says she needs to say it in person, that letters aren't enough for some things. I thought about that, about the things that letters couldn't hold, about his father's journals, all those careful words trying to contain grief and wonder, and the specific weight of loving people on a mountain where everything was hard and transient. His father had written everything down because he hadn't always been able to say it, and the journals were the record of a man trying to bridge the gap between what he felt and what he could give voice to. Riker wasn't his father. He was less patient, less literary, more likely to say a thing badly than to write it well. But he had learned, in the long winter just past, that saying the thing badly was generally better than not saying it. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to know something," he said. He looked at the property ahead of them, the yard, the barn, the mountain rising behind everything in the late afternoon light, the graves behind the cabin that he still visited on quiet mornings, that he'd started visiting differently since winter, with less of the particular loneliness that grief becomes when there's nobody to share it with. "When Granger made that arrangement, I agreed to it for the land. That's true. I'm not going to pretend it was anything else at the start." "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. I'm not saying it as a confession. I'm saying it because I want you to understand the distance between that and where I am now." He paused. He was not good at this. He was doing it anyway. "This is your home. Not because of a legal arrangement. Not because you have nowhere else. Because you made it yours and because—" He stopped. Tried again. "Because the best version of this place has you in it. And I don't want a version that doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light moved across the yard. A pine siskin called from somewhere in the spruce line, a small bright sound in the big quiet. "That's the most words I've ever heard you say at one time," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "Don't make me do it again." She laughed. The real one. The surprised one. The one that transformed her face. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, briefly, the weight of it easy and deliberate, and he put his arm around her and they sat on the porch steps of a cabin on a mountain in May and looked at the world coming back from winter. Victor Hale was convicted in federal court in August on 9 counts including fraud, conspiracy, and the illegal manipulation of financial instruments across 4 railroad companies. The trial produced testimony that filled 3 days of reporting in the Cheyenne newspapers and rippled outward into conversations about the railroad industry that would continue long after the verdict. Silas Granger was convicted on 6 counts, including his role in directing the falsification of records and his 3-year financial partnership with Hale's operation. The First Territorial Bank of Cutter's Ridge was placed under federal receivership. Its mahogany furniture and gold-painted signage were inventoried and dispersed. Riker read the verdict in the newspaper that the Cutter's Ridge General Store received 2 weeks after the fact. He read it at the supply counter, standing up, and then he folded the paper and bought his flour and salt and rode back up the mountain without saying much to anyone. Eleanor read it that evening by the fire. She read the whole article, including the part where her name appeared in the context of the material cooperation that had been instrumental in building the federal case. Just her name, in print, associated with something other than accusation. She set the paper down on the table. How do you feel? Riker said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Like something that's been sitting wrong for a long time just got moved, she said. Not fixed, not undone, just moved into the right position. He nodded. That was exactly right, he thought. Some things didn't get fixed. They got moved into positions you could live with, and that was a different kind of resolution, but not a lesser one. Clara arrived in July with her husband Thomas, who was a quiet carpenter from Cleveland with broad hands and a careful manner who sized Riker up in the first 10 minutes and evidently decided he was acceptable. And with May, who was 2.5 years old and had Clara's easy laugh and an opinion about absolutely everything, exactly as advertised. May decided within the first hour that the barn was the most important location on the property, and that Riker was the person most likely to facilitate access to it. She followed him to the morning feeding on the second day, a small determined figure in the yard, and he looked back at her once, and she looked up at him with complete confidence that she was supposed to be there. He held the barn door open. She went in and stood in front of the horses with her hands on her hips, and said something in the incomplete language of a person who has not yet finished acquiring vocabulary, but has no shortage of things to express. That one's the dun, Riker said, indicating the horse. And that one's the bay. The bay bites if you put your fingers near her mouth. May looked at the bay horse. Don't, he said. She looked at him. She had Eleanor's eyes, he realized. Not the color, but the quality of them, that steady appraising attention that measured things and stored them. Okay, she said solemnly. He spent 20 minutes in the barn with a 2-year-old who wanted to know the name of every single object she could point to, and he answered every question, and somewhere in the middle of it he understood that this was the thing his father had written about in Volume 11, the unremarkable, ordinary moments that turned out to be the ones that mattered. Clara and Eleanor talked for a long time on the second evening, sitting on the porch after Thomas had gone to bed, and May was asleep in the back room on the narrow cot that had been their father's. Riker was inside, nominally reading one of Cale's journals, actually aware of the voices on the porch, the way you're aware of a fire, the warmth of it registering even through walls. He couldn't hear the words clearly. He caught fragments, Clara's voice rising with emotion, Eleanor's lower and measured in response, then Clara again, and then a long quiet, and then what sounded like both of them talking at the same time and then stopping at the same time, which was the sound of sisters finding their old frequency. He didn't need to hear the words. Some conversations were private by nature and complete by nature and didn't require witnesses. He went to bed before they came in. Clara and Thomas left on a Friday morning in the 3rd week of July, with May asleep against Clara's shoulder and the horses standing patient in the early light. Clara hugged Eleanor for a long time at the fence line, and when she pulled back, her face was the open, uncomplicated face of someone who has said what they needed to say and is leaving lighter than they arrived. She looked at Riker. Take care of her, she said. He glanced at Eleanor, who was looking at him with the expression that meant she was about to say something about being capable of taking care of herself, which was entirely accurate, and which he was going to let her say. We take care of each other, Riker said. Clara looked between them. Something crossed her face, or recognition, maybe, or the particular satisfaction of seeing something work the way it's supposed to. Good, she said. They watched the wagon go down the trail until it disappeared into the first line of spruce. Eleanor stood at the fence for a moment after it was gone, her hand on the top rail, looking at the space where it had been. She looks good, Riker said. She does, Eleanor said. She really does. He stood beside her. The mountain morning was warm and the light was coming gold through the trees and below them in the valley. The creek was running high and bright from the last of the snowmelt, talking to itself the way mountain water does. The roof extension, she said after a while. He looked at her. We should finish it before fall, she said. If we start the framing next week, we'll have it done before September. He looked at the cabin roof, then back at her. She was already thinking about the fall, about the next winter, about the work that needed doing to make this place more of what it could be. She was thinking about staying, in all the ways that thinking about staying meant, not just remaining in a location, but committing to its future, its maintenance, its continued becoming. He thought about what Granger had said in his office all those months ago. A practical arrangement between practical people. He'd said it like it was an argument in favor of the thing, when in fact it had been the smallest possible version of what the thing turned out to be. The mountain hadn't given them a practical arrangement. It had given them a winter, and the winter had given them everything else. Next week, he said. I'll get the timber. She nodded. She looked at the mountains above them, the peaks still carrying white on their north faces even in July. The Absaroka Range standing against the blue sky with the permanence of things that have been there longer than any human trouble and will remain after all of it is finished. I mapped the eastern ridge last month, she said. There's a meadow up there I hadn't found before, about a mile past the far trap line, elk sign everywhere. I know that meadow, he said. You didn't put it on the map you drew me. It's a hard trail up. I found it, she said. She looked at him sidelong, and there was something in it, the same quality as the first day on the trail when she'd said, "Then it's fortunate neither of us is soft." The directness of a person who had never needed things to be easy, only honest. "Show me sometime," he said. "I will," she said, "when your shoulder's fully healed." He made a sound of objection. "It's not fully healed," she said. "It's Riker." He closed his mouth. She turned from the fence and walked back toward the cabin, and he watched her go. The plain, competent walk of a woman entirely at home in a place she'd learned by hand over the hardest months of a Wyoming year. She paused at the cabin door and looked back at him. "Coffee," she said. "Then the north fence needs checking." "I know the north fence needs checking," he said. "Then come inside." He followed her in. The door closed behind them. The mountain went on doing what mountains do, holding everything, changing slowly in ways too large and too gradual for any one person to fully witness, providing the ground that everything else grew from. Not benevolent, not cruel, just present, permanent, indifferent to human trouble, in a way that was, if you were the right kind of person in the right kind of life, a source of genuine comfort. The strongest thing on Black Hollow Mountain was not the winter that had buried the cabin to its windows. It was not the grizzly that had nearly killed a man in the upper valley. It was not the silence that had held that mountain for 6 long years before a woman in a dark coat arrived in a snowstorm and refused to be anything less than herself. The strongest thing was simpler and harder to quantify and built from the most ordinary materials. 2 imperfect people in a small cabin telling each other the truth, showing up, doing the work, getting it wrong sometimes, trying again. That was all. That was enough. That was, as it turned out, everything.
Whatever. Someone redeemed door knock to help his anxiety. Don't do that. Don't. I don't think that helps. You know what? Maybe it would. Maybe exposure therapy is what I need. Dude, I think I can keep Xin Zhao alive forever if I just upgrade Sona. This Sona's cracked.